Okay, well, Professor Subramonyam, thank you so much for joining me. Made it all the way to Stanford. I'm so excited to kind of talk about some of these things with you. First question is, what is AI?
Thanks, Farooq, and thank you for making it here to Stanford. I think, just very broadly, AI is essentially building machinery to get them to emulate, to think, and behave like people at a very high level. That includes everything from perception, like computer vision, to the cognition as to thinking and reasoning, which is sort of like what a lot of the focus with today's sort of generative models is on. So that would be sort of like a very high level conceptual articulation of what AI is.
You also talk in your research a lot about UX specifically, and this word is thrown around, this phrase is thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
What is UX and how is it different from UI?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think this is sort of like what a lot of HCI thinks about. UX stands for user experience, which is a little bit more all-encompassing about how people interact with computational systems, and how do we think about designing this interchange between people and machines in the situated context of the task itself. So the UX of, say, sending an email would be more than just the interface. It would be the entire workflow. What is the information that people have? What are their needs? What are their goals? And how do we sort of design for a more positive experience to sort of support that process of communicating through this written form in an email. UI stands for user interface. And the interface is more targeted at sort of the look and feel and the inputs and outputs of the interface or the barrier between people and machines, and that is sort of designing the interface is only a small part of the entire user experience.
So the user experience is the motivation of the user and the context that they are in.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what does your research generally deal with? I know that it deals with a lot of different things and has changed recently, but maybe overarching broad strokes.
Yeah. These days, my lab is primarily focused on AI in education more broadly, and we take a cognitively informed design approach to AI in education. And when I say that in the UX sense, the sort of the ultimate, if you think about education, the ultimate goal of educating someone, or the effect that education has on someone, is to support their ability to think and create and solve problems and produce ideas. So we look at how, at least the current focus is in how can AI sort of support and augment, but also protect human cognition. Just given that AI can do lots and lots of things these days, and we deeply think about what should it do, and how do we build interface machineries and systems to sort of support that.
You mentioned protect human cognition.
Yeah. We often sort of forget protecting human cognition. If we think about, say, writing, for instance, right? These generative models can produce a lot of content and do things for you. And when we think of integrating AI in a student writing process, there are good and bad ways to design it. You could give an interface that in which the student can just say hey, write me an essay about topic X, and it would give you that essay. But that is sort of depriving the learner or the student from thinking more deeply about the writing process. But you can also design good interfaces that would sort of augment their human thinking about how to write, what they want to express, and what are their how do they organize their thoughts. And so that is where thinking about ways to maintain the desirable difficulty in learning is a form of like protecting human cognition in learning.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to the writing part.
Okay.
Yeah. So what is the field of human-computer interaction?
Wow, that is a very broad question. The field of human computer interaction sort of like broadly again like deals with this studying like human computer interchange, and it has sort of different subfields that are based on like the model of this like interaction and task, but then it's also like spans across like many disciplines and domains. So there's everything from understanding people, right? Like if we're going to build good tools and systems, computational systems, we need to understand people. So there's a lot of work on like understanding sort of like human goals and motivations and intents and the kind of tasks that they want to do. That is human computer interaction. And then there is how do we build good user experiences and user interfaces? How do we like think about like new kind of like interaction paradigms and different kinds of interfaces, right? Everything from like how do you look at a calendar event on your watch to like on your phone to on like your website to like on a big wall display or whatever it is. We think about like all of these like different interface sort of like modalities, the kind of information people would want to see like in a situated way. And then evaluation is a big part of human-computer interaction. Like how do we think about like evaluating in the immediate sense, as in like are people able to do their task better, but also in like a more socio-technical sense, and thinking about like are we building the right kinds of systems and what are the implications of these systems for like individuals and communities and societies as a whole.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements to that. There seems to be like the basic, almost entrepreneurial or product management kind of aspect of building the UI. And then the questions of ethics and almost anthropology of the human experience. Which part of that space do you like more?
I like more of the understanding people or the anthropology side of it, because I think doing that well, like understanding people and their needs better, will sort of lead to more positive like downstream outcomes, rather than like say starting in the middle, right? Like I want to build like a new AI model that does this, or I want to build a new system or interface that does this, and then trying to align it with people or aligning it with like evaluative goals or values is a much harder problem, and this is where a lot of things go wrong.
Gotcha. In one of your papers, there's a diagram that's illustrating, quote, Norman's gulfs of execution. I think if you could explain that, that'd be a nice way to concretize HCI.
Yes. So I think the paper you're referring to is the Gulf of Envisioning paper, which we published last year. And that was sort of like trying to understand like, this new wave of generative AI and like how people are interacting with tools like ChatGPT and like what is problematic. And the connection to like Norman's model is that Ed Hutchins, Jim Holland, and Don Norman, like they proposed this model of interaction and like how people interact with machines, and it has like this. It's a 7-stage model. It starts with like people's goals, like what they want to do, and then turning those goals into specific intentions. So if your goal is like you want to write an essay about say climate change, and then you need to then go from this high level goal to like specific intention. So that is the second step in Norman's model. An intention might be like, oh, I'm gonna like maybe write like an outline of the key points I want to cover, and then I'm gonna like flesh out this particular point. and then turning those intentions into like tool dependent actions, right? Like if you're writing this on pen and paper versus if you're using like Microsoft Word or like a whiteboard or whatever tool, like you need to translate those intentions into actions based on what is available to you in the tool space. If you're using pen and paper, you know that like if you write an outline, you need to add enough space for you to fill in the content, or like you need to be like, it's, you know that you can't move around and rearrange things that you write on pen and paper, but you know that like Microsoft Word allows you to like rearrange things and move things around and so on. So you translate intentions to actions, and then you execute those actions in the system. And the gulf of execution is this gap between like what you want to do, like your intentions, and the available actions that you can sort of like execute to realize those intentions. So if for some reason like your intention, like as part of your planning, is that you're going to write like an outline and then you want to like insert space to flesh out each of those points in the outline, and Microsoft Word doesn't have, like suppose hypothetically it doesn't have this ability to add spacing between sentences, then that would be a break in your gulf of execution. So it would introduce this gulf of execution. And then, or like, if you have like an intention and there's no available action for you to execute that intention, or that action becomes like really difficult for you to execute, all of these sort of contribute to the gulf of execution. And then like once you execute your action, you need to be able to sort of like perceive like what is like, did this actually happen, and then interpret that action. And then evaluate whether it met your goal or not. So that is the gulf of evaluation. And if you have systems where it's not clear what the outcome of your action is, or if it's hard to like interpret the outcome of your action, then that leads to the gulf of evaluation. So this is sort of like the Norman's model of gulf of execution and evaluation. And I can tell you maybe briefly about like the gulf of envisioning that is sort of the main contribution of that paper. And with all of these like systems that this gulf of execution and evaluation happens, like I said, like you have interfaces where the actions are visible. Like Microsoft Word has like a menu on top with like a bunch of buttons that you can then use to plan your actions. But when you're interacting with something like ChatGPT, like there are no actions, and any action is potentially possible, and that makes it really difficult for you to like translate your goals into intentions. And so that is what we call the gulf of envisioning, which is why when like many of us have experienced this like frustration when you're interacting with tools like ChatGPT, is often like playing 20 questions or the hot or cold guessing game, and that is sort of what we refer to as the gulf of envisioning.
And just to be clear, the gulf exists when it comes to prompting with something like OpenAI's GPT or any of these other chatbots, is because it's too open-ended. There is no direction. There's no constraints.
Yeah. There are a bunch of things, right? Like one, you're interacting with these models using natural language. Language is ambiguous in nature. So like the way we sort of like define it in this paper is like it's a combination of like three things. Like one is it can do anything, right? Like, there's a lot of like functional flexibility is the term that we use here. Like you can use it to like write an essay, you can use it to write a poem, you can use it to write an essay for a 5-year-old. So there's a lot of like flexibility in terms, and like the dynamic nature sort of one introduces problems. Second is like the sort of intent specificity. When you're specifying something in natural language, like, there is this sort of belief that like interacting with these computational systems in natural language is better. Ideally, yes, because like but in practice, like this doesn't always work, because like these machines don't interpret natural language or understand natural language the same way people do. Like when you and I are conversing, the specific words don't matter. I can say the same thing in many ways, unless I'm reciting poetry or something. Like, we mean the gist of what we are saying. And then people have good sort of like theory of mind about like other people that they sort of like know, and like I can sort of like tailor my conversation to like what I think I know about you. I may not always be right, but when I'm not right, you're going to ask me follow-up questions and so on. But with these models, like, they're highly sensitive to sort of like linguistic variations. Like, even if I mean the same thing, if I say it in different ways, it's sort of going to give me like different like outputs, and that is problematic. And the third is just the stochastic nature of these models and the generative nature, where it's going to, like, even the same prompt is going to give you like different responses each time you try and execute. And all of this makes it really hard for people to, like, based on their goal, plan what their action should be. And that is the gulf of envisioning.
So we've talked about some reasons why prompting is hard, and it sounded like, 1, we don't know where to start. 2, you have to be very specific. 3, you don't know what it's going to output.
Yes, yeah.
So how do we get better at prompting?
I don't think the goal is for us to get better at prompting. I think the goal is to sort of like help people like acquire some of like the action space that we talked about, and like that happens through sort of building better interfaces and better user experiences.
Okay, so you think we should take it to the product rather than the user? I mean, that makes sense, given your
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
Well, something I like to do with prompting is so if I'm not sure what I need to ask, and what I'm expecting and how to be specific, I'll literally ask GPT, here's my problem, ask me 12 MISI questions, mutually exclusive, completely exhaustive questions about this, one by one, to help me make a decision. It's actually how I decided to go on this trip. It asked me enough questions, so I was like, okay, I don't want to do this trip. It actually helps so much, because questions, I don't know what the research is, it reduces cognitive load for me.
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Like, if you are sort of like vague in your intentionality, then an LLM can sort of like help you and like guide you towards things. But if like just the generative nature, and like, don't get me wrong, like, I do think like these generative AI and large language models are quite powerful, but in ways where they facilitate these like divergent thinkings for like underdeveloped like ideas and intentions. But if you have clear goals and you know what you want to do, like the more specific and clear your goals are, like getting the LLM to execute those goals becomes a lot more challenging.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What does it mean to co-create AI?
Ooh, that's a good question. So there are many different stakeholders involved in like creating AI. Like, when we think about like people who make AI, a lot of times we think about like the machine learning developers or the engineering teams who are sort of like doing the actual like programming work of like realizing these AI machinery. But there's a lot more to that, right? Like, if you think about machine learning specifically, a lot of it is like, learning sort of like patterns from data, and then thinking about like what data should we use, and like how much data should we use, and especially if you're thinking about like more supervised learning techniques, like who's going to label these data, and like how do we acquire ground truth. And then when you think about like this behavior, like how should this AI behave? Like, what are the inputs we should give to like the AI, and what are the outputs it should produce in what format? And then like what kind of application should this AI support? So there are like lots and lots of questions that I don't think like AI or machine learning engineers can answer alone. And this is where you need like a diverse range of experts with different expertise, everyone from like user experience designers to potentially domain experts who are experts in data, to then thinking about like also like ethicists and legal practitioners and all of these sort of different stakeholders and their expertise. And like when I say like we should like co-create AI, it is like working across these different expertise and building like good sort of like realizations of like AI capabilities. In a lot of so the first approach is where which I think I call like an AI first approach, where there's a machine learning team that's going to go and like through some sort of like engineering process, like build like an AI capability. Um, and then they're going to go to like some product team and say like, hey, can you figure out a way to put this into your product? And that's not a good way.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, like with traditional HCI, like the human centeredness, where the user experience designers first design the experience and then give like specifications of those experience to the engineering team and say like, hey, build this. That is not going to work either with AI, just because of the sort of like dynamic statistical nature of these models. You're not hard coding behavior, you're getting it to learn this from data. So this is another interpretation of like co-creating, where you need the design and engineering sort of like working together to like envision and conceive and co-create the AI from the ground up.
And so what does that look like on the ground? Is that doing user interviews as you train the model, or I guess fine tune the model while making the interface all at the same time because things are changing and tweaking?
I think it starts with sort of like understanding like the behavior that you want to emulate. Like when you asked your first question, like what is AI? I said it's like machinery that can like think and act like people, behave like people. So I think the first thing then would be is to think about like what is this behavior that you want and why, and this should be grounded in like what people currently do and like the kind of tasks they do and like what is the reason behind this behavior. And then there is the way of like thinking about like what data, right? Like what data do people currently use, what data do they have access to, what data are they willing to provide, and like thinking about like data privacy and all of that. And then figuring out like the feasibility of like learning this behavior from this data and learning it well across like different sort of like people and contexts, and like making sure this data is like representative of like different target users. So that would be sort of the next step, and like the interface comes a little bit later, like then once you have this model and when you sort of see like where it does well and where it performs poorly. A lot of like in the AI world, a lot of like human computer interaction focuses on sort of like complementing or like making up for the limitations of these models, right? Like models in real time can use feedback from users to sort of like improve its behavior. So how do you think about the feedback? How do you think about like explainability? Like when a model makes a recommendation or produces an output, how do you like design for people to understand like why did it make this recommendation and so on? So like the interface happens in parallel, but starting with the data and aligning like these machine learning models like data needs with like human data like use and like what people need, and then like aligning the behavior across like humans and AI, and then thinking about like these interfaces and interactions that are sort of like grounded in like specific tasks is sort of how to think about like co-creating AI.
Yeah, you mentioned in the paper, or it was mentioned in the paper, actual tools that are better to be used between AI engineers and designers to co-create AI. What are those tools? What were some of those discoveries?
Yeah. So in my lab, we've built a bunch of tools. One is like failure notes, especially when you have like a set of like initial like pre-trained models, which these user experience designers are working with. Then you need ways for people to sort of like evaluate, like by people I mean like user experience designers, to evaluate like the potential needs of the users with what these models can do. And that'll sort of like generate design knowledge for like how do you design good interfaces like given these current limitations of the AI, right? So like an AI that doesn't like perform very well should not be used to automate some task for a human, but instead it should be used to say like augment or make suggestions while like letting the human be in sort of the driver's seat. So I think sort of like understanding the space of like performance is sort of like one tool that we've developed. We've also developed tools for like interface design, like because like of the sort of probabilistic nature of these models, it's hard to like hard code specific user experiences, right? Like you can't always say like, the example I've used in the past is, imagine you're building like an app for like a bird watcher, like to be able to recognize or identify different bird species. And there's like, you can have like a huge data set of like lots and lots of images of birds that are labeled, and then like the app where you take a picture of this bird and then it'll tell you what the bird is. But it's not going to be accurate like 100% of the time. So when you know like in what ways these fail, then like how do you help, like, maybe it has like two potential like labels or suggestions. It may think like this bird is A or B or whatever. And then how do you surface this to the user in a way that sort of like helps them understand and like make these choices? So sort of like we've built tools around like this interface design given like the probabilistic nature of AI.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
This is I enjoyed reading this paper quite a bit because I write a lot, and seeing how the script and shift paper talks about the unique way of writing, properly integrating AI to write better. If you could break down that paper.
Yes. Yeah, that's been like a recent favorite paper of mine. So everyone is excited about like writing with AI, and there are lots and lots of tools that people have built to support writers. Like, even before like this wave of like LLMs came about, like, companies like Grammarly, they've been building like somewhat semi-intelligent tools that sort of like, help you like rephrase things and like beyond just sort of like spell checks, right? But like a common or like a common theme we noticed across all of these tools is that there's a lot of emphasis on like the output or like what gets written eventually, but less on why people are writing. Ultimately, like, people are storytellers. We write to tell stories. And there is a lot of work done in like cognitive science on like what makes good writing, what makes good writers, how to tell a good story, right? And the sort of like the core construct that we use in this paper is like knowledge telling versus knowledge transformation. Now I have some, say like in writing, like I have some ideas in my head, and knowledge telling would be just like me just directly like putting those thoughts or ideas in words without considering the audience at all. But instead, what makes for good writing, what makes us good writers, is we're constantly thinking about the readers and the audience that we are writing for, and that helps us transform our ideas in ways that would make it more comprehensible and that would make communicating these ideas more effective for the audience, right? Like we're writing for readers, and there's a term that's used here called recipient design. So that was our motivation in sort of like thinking about like how do we build tools that allows that allows writers to think about this like knowledge transformation as opposed to like knowledge generation or like text generation. And this is sort of what led to this idea of like script and shift. And let me briefly tell you what the script and shift tool does. So script and shift is sort of this layered interface for writing, and what I mean by that is like imagine you have like an interface like say like a physical desk, and you can put paper anywhere on the desk, and each sheet of paper can contain like some information, and then you can take the information and okay, so if you want to say try and write like the introduction paragraph to a story. Today what we do is like, because we're either using like Microsoft Word or like a typewriter or whatever it is, like you only write one introduction. At most you have like two versions, but that doesn't really help you think about like which version is the best for the audience you're writing. But what script and shift allows is that the shifting is that like once you have one page of an introduction, you can try to like shift it in many ways using an LLM to then identify like which version of this introduction is most like aligned with the kind of audience you're trying to communicate to. So that is this idea of shifting, which we support in like many different things. You can try out many different tones, you can try out many different like versions of the text, you can sort of like try different ordering of like different sections in the text. So this is where like AI is very powerful, because if people were to write 5 different versions of the introduction, it's like it's really costly, and most of us don't do this. And this is where AI can sort of like augment this human process of like trying out like different variations and like in divergent thinking, where the human writes a version and prompts the AI, and the AI is able to create these things. And then in scripting, we have what we call writers' friends in our tool, which is again like born out of this frustration of like when you're using like ChatGPT, it's a lot of like back and forth conversational nature, and like at least I strongly believe that like conversational AI is sort of like a terrible interface for writing. So then like how do we bring the capabilities of AI or the prompting interface into the writing interface, right? Like you don't like when I'm writing, I just simply want to write. Like I don't want a bunch of like menus and options, and like it's all very distracting because I am typing and like that's all I want to do. And sort of we built into Script and Shift the interface where you can just invoke what we're calling these writers friends or different capabilities like as you're writing. So you can like insert the prompt like in the text as you're writing, and it generates the content, so you don't have to sort of like work around different sort of like menus and drop downs and things like that.
So just to clarify, it's you write a section, a paragraph, and then you can ask the chatbot, or we'll just say the LLM, to come up with 5 different variations of the first paragraph.
Yeah.
But is there in the system embedded, or it forces you to go section by section, paragraph by paragraph?
No, and I think that is sort of the advantage of like Script and Shift. Like you don't have to start in an order or like follow through section by section. And it's also like non-destructive. So imagine like, I can, like if going back to the desk metaphor, I can write in a piece of paper what my conclusion has to be, and I can put it there, and then I can sort of like go to the introduction, and then I can put a piece of paper with the introduction, and I can generate like 5 variants of that introduction and like 5 new pieces of paper, and then I can try writing the middle section. So what you have is like an interface that allows you to like spatially organize many different things and like have many different layers. But then when you want to produce the final artifact, you just pick the version of the introduction you want, you pick the version of the conclusion you want, you pick the version of like the main body you want, and like stack it together, and that compiles into the final article. And then when you read the article, if you don't like that order, you can like rearrange the stack or remove a piece of paper from the stack and put another like a different version of that thing into the stack and generate the article again and like see what that looks like.
That's very interesting. That almost forces you to rethink how people have been taught how to write essays.
Yeah, like I think so, people started writing using typewriters, and when like companies like Microsoft started building things like Word, they sort of like adopted the page metaphor, and it's all like just very linear page by page. But what Script and Shift does is it sort of gets away with this like linear nature, because with LLMs there's this power of like exploring these different variations, and that's sort of like what we wanted to emphasize with like Script and Shift, or like support with Script and Shift.
I'm curious, when you guys tested this, did you find that users were not going in chronological order often or sometimes?
So if you look at the paper, right, like they were engaging in a lot of like divergence in generating many different variations. Like they were not going in chronological order.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And what were they usually writing? Would it be an essay or?
So we tested it out like in person, where people were writing essays. They were writing like stories and essays in sort of like different contexts.
Very cool. Yeah, that's interesting. Is this something that's available to be used?
Yes. So we have like the website is called writersfriends.com.
Okay.
You can go to the website. Currently, like you can use the tool, except for now you'll have to put in your own sort of like LLM key. Like it can be like an OpenAI LLM, Claude, whatever. But you need to enter your own key, and then you should be able to use the tool. But the tool is available online for you to use. Yeah.
I'll definitely check it out then.
Yeah. We actually had like a few people reach out. Like we had a writer from a screenwriter from I think Germany reach out, and like they've been trying out our tool.
Oh, nice.
And like we had recently a student who was interested in like using this to write their dissertation.
Oh wow. Oh my God. Yeah, that'll be really interesting to see.
Yeah.
Your most recent work deals with application of AI to education. If you don't mind talking a little bit about that.
Yeah. And I think this is maybe like elaborating or following up on your earlier question of like, what are we currently like working on? Like a lot of the work is in AI in education, and the focus is on like creating things with AI. As I said, right, like the ultimate goal of like education is so that people are able to create things, solve problems, and all of that. But today there's not a ton of opportunity in like formal like school system that allows students to be creative. So essentially, like the constructivist approach to learning, like while is amazing in theory, and like it's hard to operate. It has been hard to operationalize in practice. And a lot of today's like classroom teaching is sort of knowledge passing from the teacher to the student, and then like you take a test, you do well, you get to go to the next grade. Our focus is a little bit different, and like we've been thinking more about sort of like this knowledge building and like how do we help children learn by creating. Like the paradigm we're calling is sort of like learning by creating. And we're looking at this across like different domains, from like STEM learning to like creative writing to storytelling. So as a simple example, right, like if you want to get someone to understand, say, what causes coral bleaching, you could give them some text about coral bleaching and hope that they sort of like acquire like this causal model of what causes coral bleaching. You can ask them to write an essay about that understanding, or you can ask a child to set up an experiment, maybe like a virtual simulation of what causes coral bleaching. And all of these things will help these different like techniques will help the learner acquire different sort of like models or like different views of what causes coral bleaching, right? Like a lot of times the emphasis with like writing and things like that is on like communication ready knowledge. Like the learner may become really good at telling you about what causes coral bleaching, but then if you give them like a specific problem, like, hey, there is coral bleaching happening here, like how would you fix it, they're not going to be able to do that. But if you allow a child to, like a learner, to create like their own simulation of a coral bleaching, where now they have to think about all these like different variables and the parameters and how these variables are linked, they develop a much richer model of coral bleaching, a richer internal representation of coral bleaching, which then facilitates problem solving and so on. So this is what generally creation does, at least in what, in the research we're doing. Like we find that like learners acquire richer representations, richer internal representations of knowledge that allows them to do things in the future if they're able to create their own sort of like representations.
Would you say this is kind of building off the constructivist tradition?
It is definitely building off the constructivist tradition. It's like so.
And maybe if you want to quickly define what that is for the users.
Yeah.
Or for the listeners. Talking about HCI too much.
Yeah. So I think like at a very high level, like constructivism is like enabling learners to sort of build their own knowledge instead of like giving them like pre-constructed like text and explanations and sort of like representation. So essentially like what we try to do in today's education is like we try to insert representations of others into the learner's mind, and the focus is on like making it stick, which is problematic. On the other hand, like the constructivist approach sort of like allows learners to sort of explore and create their own sort of like understanding. It may be like sort of like reinventing the wheel in this specific context, but that is still like very much beneficial because it allows them to build like authentic representations that is more like grounded in their prior knowledge, in their culture and all of that, which makes it more relevant and sort of like effective in future use.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I think the argument against constructivism, it reminds me of a Bismarck quote, which is that something like learning is for fools or experience is for fools. I prefer to read books. In other words, I'd rather just learn it, cut to the chase, understand what a thing is, and spend my time failing to build or acquire a representation. But it sounds like what you're saying is the acquired representation after trial and error is going to stick around longer, and you're going to have the benefit of the surrounding context in which you learned it, which allows you to solve future problems in different contexts.
Yeah, when you create your own representations as opposed to try and acquire someone else's representations.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
What are some ways AI can harm humans? So kind of zooming out.
Oh, wow, that's a very broad question. Like within like education or generally?
I'll leave it to whatever you feel most comfortable answering in which domain.
What are the ways in which AI can harm humans? So I'll talk a little bit specifically about cognition and education and creativity, maybe. And this goes back to this point about people are inherently like storytellers. A lot of what we do is to express ourselves, but in a social world, like expressing ourselves effectively is also like challenging for many people. And what we're starting to see is that the use of AI tools in a lot of ways allows people to bypass this effort of being more intentional about like your own thinking and the way you're expressing yourselves. And there are sort of like multiple facets of harm that this sort of like introduces. Like one, you're not engaging in like deeper cognition, which means when things go wrong, like you don't have good ways of like fixing things, you're not learning things. There is, of course, like, everyone's like given like these models when AI, like I'm assuming you're referring to like generative AI and large language models, like this is sort of like the way like LLMs produces content is towards like the center of like some distribution. So what you're starting to see is like lack of originality, lack of creativity, lack of authenticity. Everyone's like essays start to sound the same, like the kind of slides or images that people produce will start looking the same. And I think without that divergence, like we become sort of a less interesting society. And then there's of course like things like copyright and like there's sort of like use of other people's like content in ways that are like not intentional and like not knowing whether you're using other people's content, and like all of these are the kinds of harms that at least like we think about in our research. And I'm sure that like the space is like much more broad than what we can cover in today's conversation. Yeah.
No, but that's would you I'll come back to this later actually, but what is on the flip side, what are some things that you're excited about human AI interactions?
I think like I said, right, like a lot of creativity requires like effort, and I think AI can augment the sort of like creative thinking in many ways, especially like divergent thinking, right? Like it can sort of like steer people in thinking about like things in ways that they have never thought about before. And I think this is very powerful in like helping people be more creative. So I think that's sort of where I think these models shine a little bit, is in the sort of divergent thinking.
What's an example of it helping you with your own divergent thinking? Did it write a paper for you?
I wish. And I hope someday it can write the paper for me. No, but I think, okay, so here's like a really good example where I've found the use as an educator, as a teacher, I've found the use of AI sort of like helpful is in helping me like come up with like good examples for my lecture materials. So at the beginning of the course, I usually send out a survey asking students about their like current interests and background and all of that. And often in my teaching, I try to like, like insert or put in like enough examples that sort of like resonate with sort of like different students. And
Very
that's
interesting.
sort of been like a really hard thing for me to do on my own. And this is something that changes with like, every time I teach the class. And I do find that like, given a concept and like given some like interests of my learners and getting the AI to generate good examples, and I think it does a really good job of it.
Well, what is one thing you'd like future generations to know about AI and the human experience today? So you have the vantage point of, let's say, the destruction of later generations or the good that might happen from AI, or both probably. And so what would you have to say to them?
Wow. What would I have to say to future generations about AI? I think the short answer would be that sort of like we tried really hard to keep the human in the center and sort of like protect human values and human cognition. So if we failed at that, I'm sorry that you're living in a much more boring world. There's this grand aspiration for everyone to for us to like achieve AGI and like think about AGI. But we don't really know like in what ways that's going to like serve humanity very well. I don't know if this really answers your question, but if you want to be a little bit more specific, I'm happy to try again.
Well, no, it does, but that actually beckons another question, which is that a lot of people believe eventually the only difference between what is artificial and biological intelligence is literally just that one is flesh and one is neural networks, insofar as eventually some people believe an AI will be able to experience the same things that a human will. So what do you think? Because I know you mentioned that what if we forget about the human in the center of all of this? Well, what if the line between human and computer is completely gone? What do you think about that?
So I don't know why that is an important point or an important question. Like, we live in a social world where sort of like people are in many ways like dependent and connected to other people. So in a world where like the line between like what it is to be like a human and an AI is sort of like blurring, like I don't know like the significance of that question, to be honest.
Well, insofar as I think what you were getting at earlier was that we don't want AI to diminish the human experience, but there will be, I believe that we'll get pretty close. We probably will get to the point where essentially AI and humans are one and the same thing, and they're not necessarily, one isn't necessarily diminishing the other because they're literally the same thing. The only thing that's different is the substrate, the stuff that leads to the consciousness or
so
ability.
Essentially like you're carrying 100 humans on your phone. Is that the vision?
Well, I mean that. It's assuming that, I guess that goes back to the whole singularity, which is that you'll be able to upload yourself to the cloud and such. But I guess to me, it's like, if are you protecting humanity if whatever we call humanity is going to be replicated by the very thing you think might be hurting it?
Again, like, I think I go back to this like question about like, what is sort of like the reason for our existence, and like what are we like excited, like why are we excited about being humans? And I think like this goes back to like us being able to express ourselves in interesting ways, in social ways. And I think that's sort of like what the at least like my focus is. And like I don't the AGI question is less interesting to me. Like, so what if you can like upload yourself somewhere, or like, so what if you have like 100 agents that have sort of like human level intelligence, like living on my phone? I don't know, right? Like, yeah, I don't, yeah. Can you repeat your question again?
Well, we're not. It's like almost like a dialogue now, and that's great. But it's more so. To me, and this is a lot of people who are more on the accelerationist school of thought, like Douglas Hofstadter and Daniel Dennett, who believe that really all that is needed for consciousness and the ability and meta-consciousness, which is exactly what we have, right, is just those simple properties that become recurrent, and then you have emergent properties.
Sure. That's fine. Like, all of that is fine.
Right.
But what does it mean to you?
Sure. To me, what that means is, if that is true, then we ought to treat AI in the same way we treat each other, insofar as that they can probably have the same experience, maybe not the same, but of similar nature experience of the world that we do. And so at that point, is AI a threat to human experience, or just literally a duplicate of our experience?
Okay, if you're saying that AI is another human, are other people a threat to you, is the question?
Yeah, basically. Well, that's my kind of what I'm trying to get at is that.
Yeah, I think I fundamentally think like that's the wrong way of like thinking about things. And I think this sort of like goes back to like our sort of like social values, right? Like, and I think sort of like instilling those values is sort of like what is more important, and like how we can sort of like coexist and like benefit as people.
Sure.
And I think from that standpoint, like, just thinking more about like at a communal level, like, sure, if like people and AI can like coexist in productive ways, that's fine. But like, at least like, in my work, like, I don't think too much about like sort of like existential threats. So like, I don't believe I'm an expert in like answering this question for you.
I'm sorry?
I don't believe I'm an expert in answering the specific question about like AGI.
Sure.
I don't. The only thing I'll say is like I don't believe we'll get to AGI like any in the near future, just given like the sort of like the current state. But the more important question is like, what is the intentionality, or like why do we need AGI beyond some like weird like AI technical aspiration?
Yeah, that's
because when I ask people, like, like I do have colleagues in the industry who are all excited about AGI. I was like, okay, like what do you hope like to achieve, or like what would like in what ways would like humanity benefit from like AGI? Most people don't have a good answer. It's mostly sort of like this grand technical aspiration.
Yeah, I think you're going back to the Jurassic Park question. Are we building for the sake of building out of pride, or is
at least that is how I see like all of these people who are excited about AGI are like just building for the sake of building.
Yeah, and I definitely sense that. Yeah. And honestly, I get excited too, because it's cool to just build things sometimes. Sure. But I think something that you're doing, and the HCI approach is I think going back to what you said originally, is to keep the human at the center. Yeah. And then I push back saying, well, isn't the thing that we're protecting from also just a human 20 years from now? But anyways, this is my final question. If we were to excavate down at the very core of all the work you've done, what is one concept, idea, image, or person or inspiration that motivates you?
I think the concept of human cognition is what excites me the most about the work I'm doing. It's not about the interface, it's not about the technology, it's more about like helping or like understanding like how we sort of like think as people, and how we create and generate as people, and how do we sort of like make that better for all, right? Like, because our thinking is shaped by many different things, and the focus is mainly on like human thinking and like how do we sort of like enable like people from like different backgrounds and cultures to like think individually but also together.
Cool.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me. This was an incredible pleasure. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you, thank you. These are all great questions, and thank you for coming all the way here to chat with me.
Of course.
Yeah.